A question that I get quite often is from people who bake sourdough bread but decide to switch over to fresh milled flour. And they want to know, how do I switch my sourdough starter over to fresh milled flour? And does it behave differently? Are there adjustments I need to make? And so today I'm going to kind of walk you through how easy it is to transition your sourdough starter from all-purpose flour to fresh milled flour. We're going to talk about the differences that it makes and some little tweaking that you may need to do as far as the feeding ratios. Also, the fermenting time is a little different. And then we're going to talk about switching out all of these flours, you know, from week to week even, and if it really makes a difference on how your starter behaves and flavor wise and fermentation time wise and things like that. So let's jump right into today's video. So my sourdough starter has been fed fresh milled flour for a long time now, and people ask, how did you just start one with fresh milled flour, or did you just switch it over? And originally I just switched over my all-purpose flour sourdough starter to fresh milled flour. And I have made a starter out of fresh milled spelt. I have a video of that and I'll link it down below. But I really just kind of started, instead of feeding it with all-purpose flour, I just fed it with fresh milled flour. And you can do that and do it at the same ratios, but you're going to notice some differences in the thickness and stuff like that. So let's dive into what you need to know before you do it to make it a little more smooth. So let's say you have a sourdough starter. You've been feeding it nothing but all-purpose flour for years, and you're concerned, as anybody would be. You don't want to do anything to your sourdough starter that causes it to be less active or not perform the way that you want it to. And so when you first feed your sourdough starter with fresh milled flour, I get this question or these comments. I fed mine with fresh milled flour and it doesn't rise. And you know, it doesn't look like it did when I fed it with all-purpose flour. And so there are just a few little adjustments to make. Now, I'm feeding my sourdough starter today. I have just a tiny bit in my jar, and it has been neglected over, I would say, the past 3 weeks, because it got pretty cool here, but not cool enough to build a fire. And when that happens, I always kind of lay off long fermented sourdough things because it takes forever. And my proofing box, unfortunately, I damaged the electrical part of it. I need to get another one, but I just haven't done it yet. And so I've been making yeast bread and waiting for it to either warm up or get cold enough to have a fire in the wood stove. And it's kind of warmed up now, so I'm going to feed my sourdough starter. And I'm going to feed it with hard white wheat, freshly milled hard white wheat. Now, to do this and to get the exact amount of flour that I want to feed my starter, I meal up 2/3 of a cup of fresh or of wheat berries, and that gets me about a cup of fresh milled flour. Now, the hard white wheat is like the closest thing that we have to all-purpose flour when we are using fresh milled flour, but it still behaves a bit different, because fresh milled flour absorbs water different. It's thirsty. And so you can't just feed your starter and then say, well, that's how it is. Like with all-purpose flour, you can feed it a cup of flour, a cup of starter, stir it up. That texture and that thickness of the starter, 5 minutes later when you go back, it's going to be the same. Whereas if you feed it with a fresh milled flour, the texture you get right at first is going to change, because it takes that fresh milled flour a little longer to absorb up all of that water. So what you're going to notice is it's going to look like it's right. And then when you go back 10, 15 minutes later, it's going to be a lot thicker than what it was when you first fed it. And so that's an adjustment that you can either make or just keep it thicker. I choose to just keep a thicker starter, but you will need to just adjust that water a little bit. So what I always say is, when you mix it up, when you add your flour and your water, get it just a bit thinner than what you actually want your sourdough starter to be, and that way that'll accommodate for that absorption of water, and you won't see that thick, more dough-like sourdough starter if you don't adjust that water. Now, this changes with different flours, and so we're going to get into that in just a minute, but I want to make sure that, you know, I make that point. Fresh milled flour absorbs water differently than all-purpose flour, so the texture is going to be different in 10-15 minutes than what it was right at first. So just keep that in mind. If you don't care, like I really couldn't care less, but if that's important to you, then you want to make an adjustment and add a little bit more water. I would start with maybe a few tablespoons of extra water. Just get it a little thinner than what you actually want the starter to be, and you should be fine. Now, if you want a thick starter, don't worry too much about it, because, or a stiff starter, because just make it thick to begin with and it'll be perfect. And so that's my main advice for using fresh milled flour to feed your sourdough starter. Now, let's talk about the fermentation time. It is quicker with fresh milled flour. So what I do, I feed my starter and put it straight back in the refrigerator. I don't leave it on the counter at all, because it is going to ferment, even in the refrigerator, much more quickly than an all-purpose flour starter just sitting on the counter. There's just more for those bacteria and yeast to feed off of, because there's so much more nutrition, I guess. I mean, I don't know the technical reason, but it does seem to be faster. And so keep that in mind. If you have an established starter and you feed it with fresh milled flour and you keep yours in the fridge like I do, just put it straight back in the refrigerator after you feed it. I do that usually the evening before, and by the next morning it is ready to use. So does it change the flavor of a sourdough starter if you use fresh milled flour? I can't really say 100% that my sourdough starter, like my bread, tastes different, because I use fresh milled flour for the bread as well, and so it's really hard to say, well, the starter made it taste different. So I'm not really sure. I would say that my bread doesn't seem to be any more or less sour than it was before, so I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Now, if you let it ferment, like your bread dough, if you let it ferment at a warmer temperature, it's way less sour, but that's true with all-purpose flour too. So I can't say that I've noticed any big difference as far as the flavor of my bread since I've switched everything to fresh milled flour, other than the obvious. It does taste different than all-purpose flour or sourdough bread, but the starter part, like that sour part, I can't say that I've noticed a big difference with that. So let's talk about another big question that I get about fresh milled flour and sourdough starter. Can I just switch between these flours? Absolutely. I have used them all: hard white, hard red, soft white, kamut, einkorn, spelt, emmer, rye, you name it. I've used it in my sourdough starter, and it's never acted that much different. So if you want to switch back and forth, because a lot of times people who mill flour, I've gotten this from a lot of you all, have extra left over sometimes, and that's what they want to feed their starter, and it's not always the same flour. So depending on what it is, just throw it in there and feed it. It's fine. It's not going to be able to tell a big difference. You can even go back and forth with all-purpose flour and fresh milled flour, and it'll be fine. My only advice is, if you do notice that your starter is getting a little bit sluggish, I would consider refreshing it. And what I mean by that, it's not a technical term. I don't know, a lot of people would be like, what does that even mean? For me, it means taking a tablespoon of my starter and putting it in a clean jar, and then feeding that a cup of flour and some water, and giving it a small amount of that starter, a lot to feed off of. And I've always done that, probably at least once every couple, 2 to 3 months, just to keep it vigorous and happy. The more starter you have that you have fed, the less strong that it is in the long run. Because if you take a tiny little bit of starter and you feed it a good amount of flour and water, it becomes even more vigorous. And so that's something that I would highly recommend you do every so often if you notice that your starter's getting just a little bit sluggish raising your bread dough. And then, you know, it always makes a difference for me. So that's just my advice for what's helped me. But as far as switching back and forth between flours, I have never had, not ever once, to feed my starter and then be like, wow, that didn't act right. I will tell you, and I alluded to this at the beginning of this, is that you won't always notice it act exactly the same as all-purpose flour, but it is still active. So if you see the bubbles, you smell it, it's not always going to rise up to the top of that jar. Sometimes it will, but it doesn't always act exactly the same as an all-purpose flour being fed to the starter. But it's still going to be just as active. Actually, mine is way more active, way more strong as far as raising a lump of dough than it was when I fed it all-purpose flour. And so if that gives you any idea. The differences in the flours that you feed it, one thing I do want to note is if you feed your starter soft white or einkorn, those two, then you probably won't need as much water as you do with like hard white wheat, hard red wheat, kamut. And for some reason, the softer wheats, well, I know what the reason is. They have more moisture in them. And so they don't require quite as much water as a hard red or hard white wheat that has a low moisture content. So just keep that in mind. And you can do it just by looking. When you feed your starter and you're stirring it up, most people that have a sourdough starter have a preferred thickness that they want, and just kind of lean into that, even with fresh milled flour. But keep in mind, it is going to thicken up a little. I mean, it's not like it's going to turn to cement or anything, but it is going to thicken up a little as that flour absorbs that water. So to just, recap, you can change your starter out as far as the flour that you feed it anytime. It doesn't matter if, let's say that you feed your starter freshly milled hard red wheat, maybe that's all you buy, and you run out. And the only thing that you have, the only other option you have is maybe a store-bought whole wheat flour. It's fine. It'll do just fine. Just keep in mind that hydration might be you might need to tweak it just a little bit, but that's the only difference. And, the fermentation time is going to be a little quicker. So I recommend putting it in the fridge right after you feed it so that you don't, have it just, and then you've lost that time when it was, perfect. And then, switching back and forth between the flours, I would just say, if you're using a softer, higher moisture level, which is einkorn and soft white wheat, that you're going to need a little less water. So those are my big tips for changing out your flours. I'm writing a blog post about this. I'm right in the middle of it, and it's a long one talking about these things. And so I'm going to circle back and put it in the description box of this video just as soon as I get it up. But the point that I wanted to make is that you don't need to start a new starter. You don't need to, start all over because you've went into fresh milled flour. You can just switch that one over. I've had this same starter for a long time. I've made other starters in the past, but I have had this particular, the only one I have now, for a long time. And it's been fed everything and it's fine. It is no problem at all. So if you have any questions about this, please leave me a comment in the comment section below. And also let me know, do you feed your starter fresh milled flour? And did you kind of move from an all-purpose starter and just start feeding it fresh milled flour? And how was your experience with that, so that you can help others that are watching that are on the fence about doing that, and give them some courage to just go for it and switch it over so that they can, ditch the all-purpose flour for good. So All right, well, that is all that I had for you today. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, again, leave them in the comment section below. And thanks so much for watching. I'll see you back here next week, same time, same day.